welcome to another episode of Unfiltered at the Water Cooler from Kreneon. My name is Melissa Evers, and I'm a co-founder of Kreneon and head of ecosystem. I am delighted today to welcome Val Fishman, one of our advisors, as part of our effort to introduce you to our advising team, to the water cooler to have a little chat, a virtual chat. And I'm so excited to have you, Val. So let's get started with a little bit about your story. You've had an incredible career across so many different vectors of the water sector and have done some really innovative things. And I just would love to hear you talk a little bit about your background and what brought you to this moment and your engagement with Kreneon.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Melissa. I am thrilled to be here and always enjoy participating in podcasts, so this will be fun. In terms of my background, I have been in what I would call sort of the corporate water stewardship space for over a decade now, and have been really kind of at the forefront of figuring out how a lot of these corporate water positive commitments get implemented on the ground. So my origin story with Kreneon actually started before the company looked the way it does today. So Michael Owelling, he originally reached out to me when he was exploring broader ways to kind of unlock private capital for water. What stood out for me was that he was asking the right kind of question. He was asking, how do we move beyond fragmented one-off water projects and create mechanisms that can unlock private capital for solutions that already exist? And this is something that I've been asking myself in this space for a long time. So I've spent a lot of my career around water markets, corporate water stewardship, and project implementation. And so one of the things I've noticed is that really good ideas need the right ecosystem around them. And so when I first met Michael, I felt that he had a compelling vision, and what he needed was really just the complementary expertise around technology, markets, finance, and ecosystem building. So for me, like my why Kreneon moment, why did I want to get involved, was really about the potential to help strengthen and accelerate work that could move capital toward water solutions that already exist.
That makes total sense. For folks who don't know you, would you mind talking a little bit about your work with BEF and some of the innovative solutions that you've pioneered in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was with BEF for about 11 years. And when I joined BEF, BEF stands for Bonneville Environmental Foundation. And BEF is a nonprofit that is based in Portland, Oregon, but operates nationally and increasingly internationally. When I joined them, I joined originally to help run their renewable energy credit and carbon offset markets. At the time, they were pioneering something called the Water Restoration Certificate. And I was very excited about that product. And the idea behind it was really to kind of model a water certificate after a REC or an offset. But we very quickly knew that it had to be localized, right? Carbon and energy have impacts on our air that are global impacts, and water is very, very local. Mm-hmm. So anyway, this was an idea that BEF had pioneered, and I guess what I would say is I am the kind of person that I will see a good vision and I will help implement it. I'm not usually the visionary, but I'm the one that can kind of help execute on a vision. So they had the vision for it, and I was very excited to take that vision and say, okay, where do we want to go with this? But like many great ideas, it did not pan out the way that I think we had all originally envisioned. And BEF found itself at this kind of nexus of helping companies understand what is your water footprint, why does it matter, and what are you going to do about it? And so it became less about a water certificate and more about corporate water strategy and what projects can companies invest in to help, balance a water footprint or reduce their impact or have a positive impact in the places that they're going to operate. So I spent almost my entire time at BEF really focused on that water market. We ended up kind of handing off the REC and offset market to somebody else at the firm. And today, I think they still operate pretty independently. They've run their REC and offset market, and then they run their corporate water stewardship business from there. So I decided to leave BEF because I noticed through my work in water that I really, if I was going to make an impact, I had to be in agriculture. And so today I am working in agriculture, and I'm helping kind of broker deals between companies that are looking to have a positive water impact in the communities that they operate in, and pairing them up with farming operations that are looking to use water more effectively or efficiently.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So, from your vantage point, which is so anchored in agriculture and farming and the evolution of smart technologies in various technologies in agriculture, I'm wondering, what do you see as the single biggest bottleneck that's holding back either water infrastructure, water stewardship today that most of the public really doesn't have an appreciation for?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think, like, as humans, we're always looking for, like, what is that single thing? And unfortunately, there never is just one single thing. And water is like one of the most complex things we deal with. So I want to be a little bit careful about the phrase single biggest bottleneck, just because water is so complex that I don't want to say that one issue outweighs the other. But really, here's what I will say is my view is that climate and water, both of them have many of the tools and technologies we need. But what we've been missing are the systems, the structures, the incentives, and very often the political will to deploy those solutions at the pace and scale required. So in water specifically, I'd say one of the challenges is that the sector has not had the same kind of scalable water or scalable market infrastructure that helped like renewable energy grow, for example. So I was just talking about renewable energy credits or certificates. So renewable energy certificates, power purchase agreements, and there's other market tools in renewable energy that really created ways for capital and demand to move through that transition to a renewable energy future. Water has had important project level efforts. There's huge corporate water stewardship commitments, but it has not had a standardized, equivalent, trusted, investable structure at comparable scale. So that's where I think Kreneon is really interesting. Whether someone agrees with every element of the model or not, the team is trying to address a real structural gap. Water infrastructure and water generation solutions need capital, but the market does not yet have the transparency, verified data, standardized units, and transaction structures needed to move capital efficiently. So I don't think the hidden constraint is that we lack ideas. I think it's that we've not built enough trusted pathways for money to move toward implementation. And I think Kreneon helps solve that.
Yeah. You posted something recently on LinkedIn, a thank you note from one of your farmers. I'm curious, when you think about the value and some of the challenges that you just described, how do you think that might impact the folks that you work with today?
That's such a good question. Yeah, the farmers. So I have been humbled in this position because, again, similar to when I started at BEF, I was like, oh, water restoration certificate, awesome! Like this is going to solve our challenges, and BEF has been an absolute pioneer in this space and has helped create and move this corporate water stewardship movement along. And I think I had the same optimism going into agriculture, like, oh, this is a really big place to impact water. And yet, here I am working one farmer at a time, right? And I think that I'm one person and I'm working with one farmer and I'm working with one company, or maybe I'm working with 5 farmers and 5 companies. That's still not a scalable solution. And so I think that, I think that if we want to have scale, we just need to have ways for like the market to recognize this. So so that specific farmer actually followed up with me and said, hey, do you have any recommendations of where I should be looking in the carbon market, right? So there are carbon markets and there are multiple entities she can look to go quantify the things that she's doing on her farm, all that tie to carbon reduction outcomes. And she has choices of where she can go. But like with water, she literally just happened to stumble across me, right? She found me. I liked what she had to say, and I went and found her some money. Like, that's the story. That is not a market. That's like getting lucky, you know? Which feels really neat, you know, one person to one person at a time, but that's not going to change the system.
Yeah.
So my hope would be that that the farmers would have access to a lot more options than one person at a time, to be able to look for, hey, if I'm going to make some, you know, enterprising decisions on my farm, you know, who are the plethora of entities that might be interested in helping finance those solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful observation. I love the focus on scale, and having, you know, standardized or institutional approaches that will enable a one-to-many versus versus a one-to-one, and not to diminish the impact that you're driving at all, because that's amazing. That's
like I said, it feels good, but you know, and it's nice to change the world one person at a time, but we're not going to get where we need to be if that's our model.
Yeah, no, totally. So I'm curious, given you have been in water for so long and you've had such an intimate view of the renewable energy transformation over the last 20 years, I'm curious if you have observations with regard to, you spoke eloquently around the opportunities for scale and standardization and market forces, but a lot of folks think, you know, it's just, this is a regulatory issue. We just need policies. We need, you know, institutional approaches by country. Do you have any color to add for folks who think this, we don't need a market approach. We need policy. Why is the approach that Kreneon's taking, in your mind, the right mechanism versus a regulatory or policy only approach?
Yeah, I love this question because all of the above is my answer. And it is not just policy, and it is not just markets, and it is not just philanthropy. It is everything. And so I wouldn't frame this as markets instead of policy or policy instead of markets. I would say that we need policy, we need public funding, we need philanthropy, and we need market mechanisms. So again, going back to my experience in corporate water stewardship, it's shown me that even when companies have very sincere goals about what they want to achieve, many of their efforts remain like bilateral, bespoke, and they're hard to scale. I mean, the example I just gave you. So they can be meaningful, but they don't always create the velocity or the volume of investment that we need. So, you know, over the last decade, I've seen corporations, NGOs, public agencies, and project developers work really hard to create water positive or water replenishment outcomes. But the transaction costs are high, the pathways are custom built, and the funding does not always reach the projects that need it quickly enough. So if we want faster change, we need both the mechanisms that can aggregate demand, create clearer price signals, and make water outcomes more legible to investors. So this is why I think the market thesis is worth exploring, not because markets are perfect, they're definitely not, but because properly designed markets can move capital faster than one-off philanthropic or regulatory approaches alone. The key phrase that comes to mind for me is properly designed. Like, how are we actually designing this? Water is obviously a public good, so any market mechanism must be built with safeguards, transparency, local context, and a clear focus on real world outcomes. So I think what's interesting about Kreneon's thesis as we think about a market-based approach is that we're not simply saying, let's monetize water and hope the market solves it, right? I hear that a lot. Is when people talk about private or market-based solutions, they say, you know, the market will solve it. I think the more important question is whether we can create a trusted infrastructure that rewards verified, net new, or clearly titled water outcomes and helps finance solutions that otherwise would struggle to get access to capital. You know, just to give a couple examples of that, you know, the pledge, I think the pledge of the company explicitly states that finance is not an end in itself, but it's a servant to physical infrastructure, and that the platform focuses with areas that are focused on like clear title, such as advanced reuse, desalination, and atmospheric generation. So I just think that policy absolutely has a place, but it also needs the market to recognize how to actually recognize the asset and invest in the asset. And I think that's what's been missing. So I think they work together.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And Mike actually published a blog earlier this week that really illustrates that, because if you look at like the renewable energy tax credits, they were in place for 20 to 30 years before we actually saw the markets beginning to move. And the markets began to move when we established a registry and a standard contract. That's when capital flowed. And so, a policy and regulatory approach and the economic incentives associated with the tax credits were real. But without that standardized contract, I thought your point around, the bespoke, the challenge, the amount of time and energy it takes to create bilateral contracts today, it doesn't move. It's not scalable. And so, having those market mechanisms with regard to the contracts and the registry, but also having the ability to have those regulatory policies that create favorable economic incentives, or at least the structures for transparency, like we see with CSRD in the EU, I think are really are important piece of the puzzle too. But then they in and of themselves are not going to actually move the needle unless we have the financial infrastructure to enable capital to engage.
Yeah, that LinkedIn post was that was an aha moment for me, just having the way that he stated that whole issue about, how the rec markets worked and how the policy was there for years, but it just didn't actually go into place. That was kind of my light bulb moment of oh yeah, that's exactly how these work together. So yeah, for anybody that's listening, I don't know how you share a LinkedIn post after a podcast, but it was a great explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can repost the blog on the post when we post the podcast, so we can get you covered. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the team that's building this. You've seen lots of startups. You've been in the foreground of new initiatives in the environmental and water space for your whole career. What is it about this team, Mike and Stan and Randy and I, that gives you confidence in our ability to pull this off?
Yeah. Well, it's not so much about the formal experience of the team. That is extremely important. I have seen a lot of experienced teams get very convinced of their own vision and not look for the holes in their vision. And so in my experience, startups can become so convinced of their own vision that they're really just looking for validation of it. So what I've really appreciated about Kreneon's approach, all of you together, is that you've been willing to seek feedback from people who may challenge the model, not just people who will say yes. In fact, most of the initial introductions that I made for Michael were people that would question the assumptions. As one of my first questions to him was, let's think of all the things that could go wrong, So, just helping to determine flaws in the model, and his embrace of understanding what could go wrong from the outset has built a lot of trust and credibility that this is being created for the right reasons. Water, I mentioned it before, it is very personal. It's local, it's political, it's emotional, and it's essential to our life, right? So if you build a market mechanism without listening carefully to the critics, the communities, the regulators, the NGOs, the water practitioners, the potential buyers, we can miss the unintended consequences. So I've seen Kreneon spend real time asking what could go wrong, where could this be misunderstood, what safeguards are needed, and how do we make this credible rather than just exciting? So the other thing that I appreciate, of course, is the team does have hugely complementary skill sets. Michael brings the vision, the persistence. Stan brings the deep technical and market infrastructure expertise. And of course, you bring the ecosystem building, finance, and the ability to translate this across communities. Randy and others bring financial discipline. So I think the combination really matters, because when you're building something like this, you've got to bring together software, finance, and all of that to solve the water problem. So the reason I trust the team is because they seem willing to grapple with any of the challenges as this gets built along the way.
I love that. And I think, one of the things that I loved about this team too, when I first joined it, was the focus on disconfirming evidence. Like, tell me why this is not going to work. Tell me what the holes are in this strategy. Tell me where there are minefields that we haven't perceived. And some of those things we discovered ourselves. Some of those things we discovered through the conversations and the introductions that you and other advisors made. And we continue to refine, right? We continue to learn. We continue to pivot as we uncover various elements, and that learning and growth mindset, as well as a sincere recognition of the gravity of the challenge at hand and the impact that we can have if we do this right, and the concerns that are reasonable with regard to how this might be corrupted or used for ill, I think are all elements that we hold with a lot of sincerity and purpose and thoughtfulness. It reminds me of, I posted a little snip that Mike had around his why for Kreneon. And that purpose, you talked about our pledge earlier, is very much inherent to the ways in which we engage and why we are working so hard to try to make this happen. And so I think it does fit together, and you stated that so beautifully. So if we pivot and we think about the future, if we think about how the world might be different, or how your farmer's experience might be different from the micro to the macro, if we roll out 5 to 10 years from now, is there something that you see in that future that makes you excited about the impact Kreneon can have?
Yeah, definitely. This is another interesting question for me, and I'm just going to reflect on some of my time at BEF before I answer the question, because I remember so often I would spend time with the CEO talking about what's our strategic plan for the next 3 to 5 years, and we would joke with each other. We're like, it is to adapt, like that, like literally that is our plan, because we can make all the plans we want, and we have to know that our plans, our best laid plans, are going to just change. And so I always struggle with the 5 to 10 year horizon question, and I'm always cautious about kind of how I answer that. But I've spent enough time around startups and setting grand visions to know that they rarely unfold exactly as planned. But if this is executed well, I would really hope to see a measurable shift in how private capital flows into water solutions. I think that is the nexus of what we are trying to solve. So success to me would mean that water is no longer treated as an afterthought in climate finance. It would mean that verified water outcomes, especially net new, clearly titled, or infrastructure linked outcomes, would have clearer value, clearer pricing, and pathways for investment. So it would mean that communities, utilities, technology providers, and project developers have new ways to finance solutions that currently get stuck because the value they create is not easily recognized by capital markets. The bigger picture is that water is at the nexus of so many climate challenges, right? It's at the nexus of all of them: food systems, energy systems, industrial growth, community resilience, ecosystem health. Every single one of those depends on water. So the irony is that water has often been treated separately from climate, either as a local operational issue or just rather than a core investment category. So if Kreneon can help change that, even partially, that would be a meaningful contribution. So my 5-year hope is not that Kreneon solves water. I've also heard that term often in too many conferences. No single company is going to do that. My hope would be that Kreneon helps prove that well-designed market infrastructure can direct more capital toward real water solutions, that it can create better price signals, and that it can elevate water as a central part of climate and resilience investment. So if climate finance has spent the last decade learning how to value carbon, the next frontier may be learning how to value water carefully, transparently, and in ways that actually finance solutions on the ground.
That's awesome. And that's exactly what we're hoping for too. I mean, when you were making your comments about how long it takes to get contracts or to get new projects financed, It's a very lengthy process. And I think one of the things that we've seen from the energy market is that, because the institutions have become standardized, because they're known, because they're standard contracts, et cetera, we can move energy development projects so much more quickly than we used to be able to do. And certainly as we look at water, we've talked to so many suppliers of these systems, and they have demand. They have the MOUs in place. They just can't get the projects financed. They have the municipalities who want to build the stuff. They just can't align, whether it be municipal bonds or all these other mechanisms that are kludgy and take too long. You just can't get these things financed. And so our sincere hope is that by replicating the energy market standards, we can really rapidly expand not only the access to capital, but the flow of capital into water infrastructure. So thank you so much. That was very eloquently put. I love that. Before we wrap, any final comments or anything that you'd like to add?
I think I said it before, but if I didn't, I think that, again, we have the solutions, right? I think we have the tools, whether we're talking about climate, water, whatever we're talking about. And I just think, our barriers have been political will, access to capital, kind of pulling those pieces together. And I mentioned earlier when you asked the question about policy, like, it's an all of the above approach. So I just see Kreneon as one of the really critical missing tools today, that hopefully will be another tool in the kit that will help just accelerate the pace and the scale, and, like you said, the flow of capital. Because I see so many people working on it and so many people desiring this. And so I do think actually maybe we are finally at the turning point where we have the political will, and now we just need to start, executing on those solutions faster. So I'm very hopeful.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I will conclude our chat at the water cooler. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of Unfiltered at the Water Cooler. And we will see you all soon. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.